There's a particularly concerning trend in the US right now towards the right, and the far left is not immune to this trend. And one thing I find very alarming is the tendency to believe that bigotry is a problem of the rural working poor, which is definitely not the case. And believing this myth, or believing that it is personal prejudice, not systemic racism, that is really at the root, is something that threatens to tear apart our most powerful weapon against fascism, which is worker solidarity. Now, I won't argue that it wasn't a stroke of genius to associate racism with uneducated, rural, poor person. A lot of people do not want to be seen as bigoted because that is the stereotype. The problem is, racism isn't bad because it's associated with poor people in the rural South that are uneducated and ignorant. Racism is a problem because it is a threat to worker solidarity, and it is factually wrong and ignorant and detrimental to humanity. And using classism to fight racism ultimately undermined worker solidarity. We shouldn't be softening our dedication to the human rights of trans people and immigrants and women's rights just because that is the trend that we're seeing in the US. Bigotry isn't a product of the working class. It is a weapon used against the working class. Now, I'm not going to deny that there are working class people that are bigoted, but the true threat to working people isn't your uncle that works a minimum wage job and hates immigrants. The real threat to the marginalized is the people that we are told are the saviors of the marginalized, the coastal elites that are always wringing their hands about the basket of deplorables who are always voting against their own interest. Although, are they voting against their own interests, or is it just the case that neither party actually represents their interests, and unfortunately they are susceptible to the rhetoric of the far right because it at least offers them some answers in times of economic crisis? And that's the thing. There is this idea that humans are naturally hateful and xenophobic, and I would argue a lot of human history shows that when people's material conditions are provided for, when they're not forced to fight other groups over dwindling resources that the owning class has hoarded, they are generally not espousing these views. These anxieties come from economic desperation, and they will always be used against the working class, against any effort to organize us. And we will not be able to organize a mass movement until we see through this. And we shouldn't be surprised that the Democratic Party is leaving immigrants and trans people and women in the lurch. They have always been a party of capitalism, and one of capitalism's greatest weapons against worker solidarity is dividing people along these lines. Although the left itself is not immune from a similar argument, although from a different standpoint, that really what we need to do is soften our stance on human rights when it comes to the marginalized and just focus on class, which is incredibly misguided. What we should be doing is doubling down on our dedication to these human rights. This idea that we need to change our stance on things like feminism and immigration and white supremacy in order to be more welcoming to people who have been disillusioned by Trump and the GOP is not a good thing strategically, much less morally. And what you're actually signaling is that marginalized groups should never trust you with their fight for liberation, because obviously their rights and their safety are less important to you than making sure that your space is a safe space for former and current bigots who haven't truly grappled with the extent of their bigotry. And I am all for people reforming, but I am not willing to sacrifice the leadership and safety of trans people and undocumented people just to bring some former MAGAs into the fold. I am going to side with the marginalized. If you want to know where to draw the line at this, you should ask the people that they have bigotry against, and they will tell you. And I am fully aware that feminism has a long history of capitulating to white supremacy. Rather, white women early on were willing to capitulate with forces that were white supremacists in order to secure their own rights, and this continues. But that's the thing. Feminism is not a product of the elite. Feminism is a working class movement. Feminism is not white supremacist, but it can be used by white supremacists. Nazis can use a lot of leftist talking points to build populism, but we know that they really don't care about free speech and aren't going to fight for it. They just don't really have an answer to a lot of the protests, so they have to pretend like they're being censored, where it's usually not the government that's trying to shut them down. But if we're going to build a truly mass working class movement, we need everybody involved. I'm not going to sacrifice the ideals that of all times we should be holding fast to, especially when it seems like everyone in the political mainstream is all too ready to abandon them in the pursuit of electability, which ultimately just means your ability to court corporate donors. The reason women's rights and trans rights and the status of undocumented people is up for debate is because these things generally don't have widespread effects on corporate profit. They do have knock-on effects, but ultimately, as long as the dollars keep coming in, they're perfectly willing to abandon these things, especially if doing so keeps the working class divided against itself. And that's why we shouldn't be for liberal identity politics, we need to be for socialist feminism. And there should be no illusions about why they're spending so much money to demonize trans people or anyone who questions the gender binary, and why they're working so hard to stir up hatred against immigrants and paint them as criminals, and why they're blaming women for a lot of the problems men have that are deeply rooted in our patriarchal notions of masculinity. It's because this serves their purpose. They want to build this hierarchy with white, cishet men at the top and everyone else at the bottom. So they blame the powerless. And if you think that this system is going to benefit you, well, wait and see. I think you'll find that is not the case. And the only people who truly benefit are the ruling class. And if you are interested in building a truly intersectional, feminist, anti-white supremacist, pro-LGBTQIA movement of working class people that is heavily class conscious and multi-tendency, just as the working class itself is, I suggest joining the Socialist Party USA. And the reason for this is we do need to work together in solidarity across a broad range of issues to unite the working class. And I think a lot of parties do it backwards, where they find a movement that is successful, like Black Lives Matter, and they try to not co-opt it. I don't think it's malicious thing on their behalf, but they go in and they think they have the answers and they're going to bring this group under their umbrella. I saw here in Minneapolis where a group comes in. They had no role in planning this march. They built none of the infrastructure, none of the funding, and they came in with a banner that was twice the size of the Black Lives Matter organizers, and they handed out pamphlets to people that had nothing to do with police brutality at a police brutality march. They're just obviously using this as a way to sell their party. And it's just such a bad look that doesn't help our cause. And I think it reflects on all socialist parties, not just theirs, unfortunately. And there are good reasons that marginalized communities should be suspicious of political parties. I mean, we have seen a long history of the Democrats consistently throwing them under the bus whenever it is convenient and when they have power, not actually fulfilling their promises to secure their rights. And I want to stress, I am speaking for myself, not for everybody in the party. We are a multi-tendency party. We are staunchly against racism and sexism and homophobia and capitalism and the two-party system, but because we are a multi-tendency party, there are different opinions on what stance we should take on some of these issues. I've worked in the Women's Commission of the Socialist Party USA for many, many years, and one thing I like about this model is it isn't the Socialist Party USA using feminism and using women's liberation to push socialism. It is inviting marginalized groups into the party where they have autonomy to organize for their own liberation and set the platform when it comes to that liberation. And that is a big difference. It is the way democracy should actually work. And if you have been frustrated with how socialist parties or the far left operates in the past, and especially if you are frustrated with groups like DSA or the Democrats not taking a hardline stance against capitalism and wanting to reform capitalism, I suggest you check out our principles and consider joining. And we do have a couple events coming up. We do have a Women's Commission meeting this Wednesday, and every Thursday we have a study group. We also have an organizing meeting coming up, and I will put links to this below. Though we are called the Women's Commission, the Women's Commission is for all people who are marginalized under patriarchy. And I understand, yes, men do face detrimental effects of patriarchy, but generally it is a system that favors men so long as they stay within the bounds of hegemonic masculinity. So I do love when men come to the meetings because it shows that they care about these issues, but this is an identity commission, so it is for people who are marginalized because of their gender. But I just want to make clear that if you are transgender, if you are intersex, if you are genderqueer or gender nonconforming, you are not only welcome, but highly encouraged to come to the meeting. And I just want to leave with an anecdote relevant to how the Socialist Party tends to view feminism. This must have been like 10 years ago. I don't remember if it was in Milwaukee or Chicago, because we had an organizing conference and a national convention back-to-back in the two cities. And I don't remember why this came up, but we were talking about how feminists took over the Socialist Party. And a man who's been in Socialist Party leadership for a long time, much longer than me, overheard this, like, feminists are going to take over the Socialist Party again? That's awesome! And he was like genuinely excited. But as far as I know, we've been a Socialist Feminist Party continuously, thanks to people like Maggie Fair and Susan D'Orazio and all the women before me that fought to be recognized and made it possible for me to be in leadership. And that is what message I really want to stress, is that if you are a marginalized person, it isn't just that you should join the Socialist Party USA, but we need you to be leading in the Socialist Party USA, because we need your leadership to make sure that your liberation is prioritized, and power is the only way to do that. I simply don't trust my liberation to be delegated to other people who are primarily focused on simply class liberation, because if we are to truly be liberated, we have to be liberated across all segments of oppression. Class may be the most overarching one, but it isn't the only one. So please consider joining, please consider getting active. And I realize that people may be undocumented or are on disability or have careers or kids or other things that may be put at risk if they become activists, especially if they are taking on leadership roles. But one thing I will say is, it is a privilege to have the choice. Right now, we can choose whether or not to get active. In the future, we might not have that choice. And in that future, it might be too late to fight. So please consider getting active while we still can choose to protect each other. For the people of Gaza, for a lot of people who have been deported, they don't have that choice anymore. And it is our responsibility to fight where they no longer can.